The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Westchester County like a shroud, concealing secrets that had festered for generations beneath the respectable veneer of one of America's most prestigious families. In the autumn of 1923, when workers began excavating the foundation for a new wing of the Fairfax Memorial Hospital, they uncovered something that would shake the very foundations of New York society. Hidden beneath the hospital's rose garden, sealed in a lead-lined vault, were 17 leather-bound journals and a collection of photographs so disturbing that the police chief who first examined them reportedly vomited and refused to speak of what he had seen for the remainder of his life. The journals, written in an elegant feminine hand, detailed nearly 4 decades of systematic horror perpetrated by 3 generations of the Fairfax family. The photographs provided visual documentation of crimes so heinous that they were immediately classified by federal authorities and remain sealed to this day. What emerged from this discovery was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American society, implicating senators, judges, industrialists, and even members of the clergy in a web of corruption that had operated with impunity since the 1880s. The story I'm about to tell you comes from testimonies that were sealed for a century, from documents that powerful interests tried desperately to destroy, and from the final confession of a woman who carried these secrets to her deathbed. If you seek the truth behind America's Gilded Age facades, if you're not afraid to peer into the darkness that lurked beneath the mansions and charitable foundations of our nation's elite, then this story is for you. But I must warn you that what transpired within the walls of the Fairfax estate challenges everything we thought we knew about respectability, philanthropy, and the lengths to which the wealthy will go to protect their twisted desires. The Fairfax family had been pillars of New York society since before the Revolutionary War. Their fortune, built initially on shipping and later expanded through strategic investments in railroads and steel, had made them one of the wealthiest families in America by the 1880s. But it was their reputation for charity and moral leadership that truly set them apart from their peers. The family had endowed hospitals, funded orphanages, and supported countless charitable causes throughout the Northeast. Their annual charity balls were legendary events that drew the cream of society from Boston to Philadelphia. At the head of this illustrious clan stood Cornelius Fairfax III, a man whose very presence commanded respect and admiration. Tall and distinguished, with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, Cornelius had inherited not only his family's wealth but also their tradition of public service. He served on the boards of numerous charitable organizations, was a major donor to the Republican Party, and had been instrumental in founding several institutions that bore the family name. His wife, Vivian Fairfax, was equally admired in society circles, a woman of remarkable beauty and intelligence. She had been raised in one of Charleston's most prominent families before marrying Cornelius in 1878. Her work with disadvantaged children had earned her recognition from both religious and secular organizations, and she was frequently invited to speak at conferences on child welfare and education reform. The third member of this triumvirate was Cornelius's younger brother, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, a respected physician who had studied at Harvard Medical School and later in Vienna, where he had learned the latest techniques in treating nervous disorders and psychological ailments. Dr. Edmund had returned to New York in 1885 with revolutionary ideas about treating mental illness, particularly in children and young adults who showed signs of moral or behavioral difficulties. It was Dr. Edmund who first proposed the creation of what would become known as the Fairfax Institute for Moral and Physical Development. The institute, he argued, would provide a haven for troubled youth from wealthy families who needed discreet treatment away from the prying eyes of society. Children who had exhibited inappropriate behavior, shown signs of mental instability, or simply proven difficult to manage could be brought to the Institute for specialized care that would restore them to proper moral and social functioning. The Institute was established in 1887 on a sprawling estate in Westchester County, far enough from New York City to ensure privacy, but close enough to allow for regular visits from concerned parents. The facility was designed to resemble a luxurious boarding school rather than a medical institution, with elegant buildings set amid manicured gardens and recreational facilities that would not have been out of place at the finest private academies. The first patients arrived in the spring of 1888, a carefully selected group of 12 young people ranging in age from 14 to 21. All came from families of considerable wealth and social standing, and all had been entrusted to the Fairfax family's care because conventional methods of discipline and education had failed to correct their problematic behaviors. Among these initial patients was 16-year-old Catherine Thornfield, daughter of a prominent Boston banker who had been caught in a compromising situation with a young man of unsuitable social standing. Her parents, horrified by the scandal that would ensue if word of their daughter's indiscretion became public, had been grateful for the Fairfax family's offer to provide discreet treatment that would restore Catherine's reputation and ensure her suitability for an appropriate marriage. Another was 18-year-old Marcus Whitmore, heir to a shipping fortune, whose violent temper and inappropriate behavior toward female servants had made him a liability to his family's social standing. His father had been assured that the Institute's specialized treatments would cure Marcus of his disturbing tendencies and transform him into a gentleman worthy of his family's legacy. The third was 20-year-old Priscilla Vanderbrook, whose family had discovered her reading radical literature and expressing dangerously progressive views about women's rights and social reform. Her parents had been convinced that exposure to such ideas had corrupted their daughter's natural feminine sensibilities, and that the Institute's moral guidance would restore her to proper ladylike behavior. What none of these families realized was that they were not sending their children to a progressive treatment facility, but to a carefully constructed chamber of horrors where their offspring would become subjects in experiments that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and moral corruption. The Institute's daily routine was designed to appear therapeutic and educational while systematically breaking down the psychological defenses of its patients. Each day began with communal prayer sessions led by Dr. Edmund, who had developed a unique theological framework that combined elements of traditional Christianity with concepts borrowed from his studies in Vienna. These sessions, which lasted for hours, involved repetitive chanting, meditation on themes of sin and redemption, and confessions of past wrongdoings that were recorded in detailed journals for later analysis. Following the morning spiritual exercises, patients were subjected to what Dr. Dunoda. This involved a combination of physical discipline, psychological manipulation, and pharmaceutical intervention designed to eliminate undesirable personality traits and replace them with more socially acceptable behaviors. The methods employed were based on Dr. Edmund's interpretation of European research into the connection between physical suffering and spiritual purification. The afternoons were devoted to character development activities that appeared to be innocent educational pursuits, but were actually elaborate psychological experiments designed to test the limits of the patient's submission to authority. These activities were carefully documented by a team of assistants who recorded every detail of the patient's responses, reactions, and progressive deterioration. The most disturbing aspect of the Institute's operations was revealed in the evening hours, when the facility's true purpose became clear. After the regular staff had departed and the grounds had settled into darkness, a different group of visitors would arrive through a private entrance that connected directly to the Institute's residential wing. These visitors, all men of considerable wealth and social standing, came to participate in activities that were described in the seized documents as therapeutic observations, but which were in reality systematic exploitation of the vulnerable young people under the Fairfax family's care. The visitors represented a cross-section of American elite society. Among them were senators who spoke eloquently about moral values in public while privately indulging in behaviors that would have destroyed their careers if exposed. There were judges whose reputations for integrity were built on their harsh sentences for moral crimes while they themselves committed acts of far greater depravity. There were industrialists who had built their fortunes on the labor of others and now sought to exercise absolute power over young people whose families had entrusted them to the Fairfax family's care. Most shocking of all was the presence of several prominent religious leaders who used their theological authority to justify and even sanctify the acts being committed within the Institute's walls. These men had developed elaborate religious rationales for their behavior, claiming that they were participating in sacred ceremonies designed to purify the souls of the young people under their guidance. The system was designed with diabolical efficiency. The patients' families, convinced that their children were receiving the finest possible care, rarely visited, and when they did, they were shown only carefully staged scenes of therapeutic progress. The young people themselves were systematically conditioned to accept their treatment as necessary for their moral development, while powerful drugs and psychological manipulation prevented them from understanding the true nature of their situation or communicating their distress to the outside world. The Institute's isolation provided perfect cover for these activities. The estate was surrounded by high walls and dense woods that prevented outside observation, while the staff lived on the grounds and were carefully selected for their loyalty to the Fairfax family. The few neighbors in the area were either employed by the family or had been convinced that the Institute was performing vital charitable work that deserved their support and protection. For nearly 4 decades, this system operated without detection. The patients who survived their time at the Institute were released as broken individuals who had been conditioned to never speak of their experiences. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But in that era, their symptoms were attributed to their original moral failings rather than the trauma they had endured. Those who did not survive were quietly buried in the Institute's private cemetery. their deaths attributed to the various illnesses and accidents that might befall any young person. The families already dealing with the shame of having a child who required such specialized treatment rarely questioned these explanations and were often grateful that their family's reputation would not be further damaged by scandal. The first crack in this facade appeared in 1924 when one of the Institute's former patients, now a woman in her 50s, was dying of cancer and decided to break her decades of silence. Margaret Whitmore, who had been 14 when she was sent to the Institute in 1889, summoned a journalist to her bedside and began to tell a story that would ultimately bring down one of America's most powerful families. Margaret's account was initially dismissed as the ravings of a dying woman, but her detailed knowledge of the Institute's operations and her ability to name specific individuals who had been involved convinced the journalist to investigate further. What he discovered was a paper trail that had been carefully preserved by someone within the Fairfax organization, someone who had been documenting the crimes for decades while waiting for the right moment to expose them. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex and far-reaching in American history. It involved federal agents, state prosecutors, and international authorities who worked together to unravel a conspiracy that had operated across multiple states and involved some of the most powerful people in the country. The evidence they uncovered filled thousands of pages and implicated hundreds of individuals in various aspects of the operation. But the true scope of the Fairfax family's crimes was not revealed until workers found that hidden vault beneath the hospital's rose garden. The journals and photographs contained within provided incontrovertible evidence of systematic torture, murder, and exploitation that had been carefully documented by someone who had witnessed it all firsthand. The handwriting in the journals was eventually identified as belonging to Vivian Fairfax, who had apparently been keeping detailed records of the Institute's activities from its very beginning. Her motivation for creating this documentation remains unclear, but the meticulous nature of her record suggests either a desire to preserve evidence for future use or a psychological compulsion to record the horrors she was witnessing. The photographs were even more damning, showing scenes of abuse and exploitation that left no doubt about the true nature of the Institute's operations. The images depicted not only the systematic torture of young patients, but also the participation of dozens of prominent individuals whose faces were clearly visible and whose identities could be established through comparison with official photographs and social registers. When news of the discovery broke, it sent shockwaves through American society that reverberated for years. The revelation that some of the country's most respected citizens had been involved in such horrific crimes challenged fundamental assumptions about morality, respectability, and the nature of power in American society. The trials that followed were conducted with unprecedented secrecy, as prosecutors struggled to balance the need for justice with the potential damage to American institutions if the full extent of the conspiracy became public. Many of the most prominent defendants were allowed to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for their cooperation in identifying other participants, while others fled the country before they could be arrested. The Fairfax family members themselves met varying fates. Cornelius Fairfax III died of an apparent heart attack shortly after the investigation began, though rumors persisted that he had taken his own life rather than face the disgrace of a public trial. Dr. Edmund Fairfax was found dead in his cell while awaiting trial. Officially ruled a suicide but suspected by many to have been murdered to prevent him from revealing even more damaging information. Vivian Fairfax proved to be the most complex figure in the entire affair. When confronted with the evidence from her own journals, she initially denied having written them, claiming they were forgeries created by enemies of her family. However, handwriting analysis confirmed their authenticity, and she eventually confessed to having documented the crimes as a form of insurance against her husband and brother-in-law. Her testimony revealed that she had been coerced into participating in the Institute's operations through a combination of physical threats and psychological manipulation. She claimed that her husband had threatened to have her committed to an asylum if she refused to cooperate, and that she had kept the journals as evidence that could be used to expose the conspiracy if her own life were ever in danger. The revelation that Vivian had been both victim and perpetrator complicated the legal proceedings and divided public opinion. Some saw her as a heroic figure who had risked everything to document the crimes being committed under her family's name. Others viewed her as an equally culpable participant who had only come forward when her own survival was threatened. The institute itself was closed permanently in 1925, and the buildings were demolished to prevent them from becoming a morbid tourist attraction. The grounds were eventually sold to the state of New York, which converted them into a public park dedicated to the memory of the victims. The broader impact of the Fairfax scandal extended far beyond the immediate participants. It led to comprehensive reforms in how charitable institutions were regulated and monitored, with new laws requiring regular inspections and independent oversight of facilities that served vulnerable populations. It also prompted a national conversation about the concentration of power in the hands of wealthy families and the need for greater transparency in philanthropic activities. Perhaps most importantly, the case established legal precedents that made it clear that wealth and social position could not shield criminals from prosecution when sufficient evidence was presented. The conviction of multiple prominent figures sent a message that American justice, when properly functioning, could hold even the most powerful members of society accountable for their crimes. The story of the Fairfax Institute serves as a reminder of how easily institutions designed to help the vulnerable can be corrupted by those who see weakness as an opportunity for exploitation. It shows us that evil often wears the mask of virtue, that respectability can be a cover for unspeakable crimes, and that the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for truth can ultimately triumph over systematic corruption. The journals that exposed the truth about the Fairfax family's crimes were eventually sealed by court order and remain classified to this day. However, excerpts that were made public during the trials provide haunting insights into the minds of both the perpetrators and their victims. One passage written in Vivian Fairfax's careful script captures the essential horror of what transpired within the Institute's walls. They come to us as children, trusting in our authority and believing in our promises of healing. We take that trust and twist it into something monstrous, using their own desire for approval and acceptance as weapons against them. They suffer not just physical pain, but the deeper agony of betrayal by those who claim to care for them. Today, more than a century after these events, we continue to struggle with the same fundamental challenges that made the Fairfax conspiracy possible. The protection of vulnerable populations from those who would exploit them remains a constant concern, as does the need to maintain vigilance against the corruption of institutions designed to serve the public good. The victims of the Fairfax Institute were not forgotten by history, and their story continues to remind us that the price of allowing evil to flourish is always higher than the cost of confronting it. Their voices silenced by their tormentors but preserved in the testimony of survivors and the records of their suffering, still echo across the centuries with a simple but powerful message. Remember us, learn from our sacrifice, and never again allow such horrors to be committed in the name of charity or respectability. In remembering them, we honor not only their memory but also our obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The darkness that consumed the Fairfax family and their associates was not an aberration but a reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature when it is not restrained by moral principles and legal accountability. What do you think about this dark chapter in American history? Could such systematic exploitation happen today under the cover of respectability and charitable purpose? The investigation into what truly happened at the Fairfax estate had only just begun. As federal agents combed through the hidden chambers beneath the former medical facility, they uncovered evidence that would reshape their understanding of the conspiracy's true scope. The documents found in that sealed vault painted a picture of systematic exploitation that stretched far beyond the walls of what had masqueraded as a charitable institution. Dr. Helena Morrison, the lead federal investigator assigned to the case, had spent 15 years uncovering corruption in America's most trusted institutions, but nothing had prepared her for the meticulous records maintained by 3 generations of the Fairfax family. Each ledger entry revealed a level of calculated cruelty that transformed individual tragedy into industrial-scale horror. The youngest victims, according to the recovered documentation, had been specifically targeted for their vulnerability. Children from broken homes, orphans with no family connections, and troubled youth whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation. The Fairfax family had developed recruitment networks that operated like a well-oiled machine, identifying and acquiring subjects through a web of corrupt social workers, compromised clergy, and desperate parents who believed they were sending their children to receive help. What made the Fairfax operation particularly insidious was its careful cultivation of public respectability. While the family conducted their experiments in hidden chambers, they simultaneously operated legitimate charitable programs that provided genuine assistance to hundreds of families. This dual approach served multiple purposes. It created a steady stream of potential victims, established credibility within the community, and provided cover for the massive financial resources required to maintain their secret operations. The recovered journals revealed that the family's psychological experiments had evolved significantly over the decades. Early entries from the 1920s described crude attempts at behavioral modification through physical punishment and isolation. By the 1940s, they had developed sophisticated protocols involving pharmaceutical interventions, sensory deprivation, and carefully calibrated psychological pressure designed to break down individual identity and resistance. Most disturbing were the detailed case studies that tracked individual victims through years of systematic abuse. The family had developed classification systems that categorized their subjects based on psychological profiles, physical characteristics, and responses to various forms of manipulation. Some victims were designated as short-term subjects for specific experiments, while others were classified as long-term cases suitable for extended observation and modification. The financial records uncovered during the investigation revealed the true scale of the conspiracy. The Fairfax family had generated enormous wealth through their criminal enterprise, selling their research to interested parties both domestically and internationally. Universities, government agencies, and private corporations had purchased detailed documentation of their experiments, often without knowledge of how the data had been obtained. Dr. Morrison's team discovered correspondence between the Fairfax family and researchers at prestigious institutions throughout the United States and Europe. The letters discussed the acquisition of experimental subjects with the same casual tone used for ordering laboratory equipment. References to procurement costs, subject preparation, and disposal procedures appeared alongside academic discussions of psychological theory and experimental methodology. The investigation revealed that the family had operated multiple facilities beyond the main estate. Safe houses throughout the region served as temporary holding locations for victims being transported between facilities. A network of corrupt officials provided protection and false documentation when needed. Medical professionals affiliated with the conspiracy provided treatment for subjects who became too damaged to continue serving as experimental subjects, while others certified deaths and provided false cause of death determinations. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of the family's long-term planning documents. The conspiracy had been designed to operate across generations with detailed succession plans ensuring that the work would continue even after the deaths of individual family members. Training protocols existed for indoctrinating new family members into the conspiracy, while financial trusts had been established to provide ongoing funding for decades into the future. The scope of the cover-up became apparent as investigators traced the web of complicity that had protected the Fairfax family for so long. Judges who had dismissed inconvenient lawsuits, police officials who had failed to investigate disappearances, and social workers who had provided steady streams of vulnerable children all appeared in the recovered correspondence. The conspiracy had infected multiple levels of society, creating a self-protecting system that had operated virtually undetected for generations. As news of the investigation spread, survivors began to come forward with accounts that corroborated the documentary evidence. Men and women now in their 70s and 80s spoke of experiences they had never discussed with anyone. Trauma that had shaped their entire lives. Their testimonies provided human context for the clinical documentation found in the Fairfax archives, transforming statistical entries into stories of individual suffering and remarkable survival. The investigation also revealed the family's international connections. The Fairfax conspiracy had been part of a larger network of similar operations throughout the developed world. Research data, methodology, and even subjects had been shared between facilities in different countries, creating a truly global enterprise dedicated to the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. Federal authorities discovered that the conspiracy had adapted to changing times with remarkable flexibility. As public awareness of child abuse increased and legal protections were strengthened, the family had modified their operations to exploit new vulnerabilities. They had expanded their targeting to include adults with mental health issues, elderly individuals without family support, and immigrants with limited legal protections. The technological evolution of their methods was particularly disturbing. While early experiments had relied on crude physical and psychological techniques, later operations incorporated sophisticated pharmaceutical interventions, electronic surveillance, and even experimental procedures that wouldn't be officially recognized by legitimate medical science for decades. The family had essentially been conducting unauthorized human trials for treatments and techniques that would later be adopted by mainstream medicine. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that the conspiracy had maintained detailed records of their victims' fates. Many had died during experiments, their deaths carefully documented and analyzed for research purposes. Others had been released after suffering permanent psychological or physical damage, their conditions attributed to pre-existing mental health issues or unrelated medical problems. Some had been transferred to other facilities within the network, disappearing into a system designed to make people vanish without trace. The financial investigation uncovered a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses that had been used to launder money generated by the conspiracy. The family's wealth had been built on decades of systematic exploitation, with profits reinvested in expanding their operations and corrupting additional officials. Real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and business interests worth hundreds of millions of dollars had been accumulated through their criminal enterprise. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the Fairfax family's operations had influenced the development of legitimate psychiatric and psychological research throughout the 20th century. Techniques that had been developed through unauthorized human experimentation had found their way into mainstream medical practice, often without any acknowledgement of their origins. The boundary between legitimate research and criminal exploitation had been deliberately blurred, creating lasting ethical questions about the foundations of modern psychological science. The discovery of the conspiracy's true scope prompted a fundamental reassessment of institutional oversight and protection of vulnerable populations. The Fairfax family had operated for generations precisely because existing systems had failed to provide adequate protection for those who couldn't protect themselves. Their success had depended on exploiting the gaps between different agencies and jurisdictions, creating a space where systematic abuse could flourish undetected. The investigation also revealed the conspiracy's influence on policy and legislation. The family had maintained relationships with lawmakers and government officials who had shaped laws governing mental health treatment, child protection, and medical research. Some of these relationships had been purely corrupt, involving direct payments for favorable legislation. Others had been more subtle, with family members serving as expert advisors who had influenced policy from within the system. The most profound impact of the investigation was its revelation of how easily systematic evil could operate behind a facade of respectability and charitable purpose. The Fairfax family had used society's trust in medical authority, charitable institutions, and established families to create a protective shield around their criminal enterprise. They had demonstrated that the most dangerous predators were often those who appeared most trustworthy and respectable. As the investigation entered its final phase, Dr. Morrison and her team faced the challenge of determining how many victims had suffered under the Fairfax conspiracy and what could be done to provide justice for survivors. The recovered records documented thousands of individual cases spanning 8 decades, but investigators suspected that many more victims had never been recorded or their records had been destroyed. The conspiracy had operated with such sophistication and for such an extended period that its full impact might never be completely understood. What was clear was that the Fairfax family had created a system of exploitation that had destroyed countless lives while contributing to the development of techniques and knowledge that had shaped modern psychology and psychiatry. The investigation's findings would ultimately lead to fundamental changes in how vulnerable populations were protected and how institutions serving them were monitored. The Fairfax conspiracy had succeeded for so long because it had operated in the shadows, protected by secrecy and the reluctance of authorities to investigate respected institutions. Their exposure would serve as a reminder that vigilance and accountability were essential safeguards against the abuse of power and the exploitation of the vulnerable. The legacy of the Fairfax conspiracy would continue to influence discussions about medical ethics, institutional oversight, and the protection of human subjects in research for generations to come. The victims who had suffered in silence for so long would finally have their stories told, their suffering acknowledged, and their courage in surviving honored. The fog clung to the valleys surrounding the Fairfax estate like a shroud, concealing secrets that had festered for decades beneath the veneer of New England respectability. What investigators would discover in the coming months would shatter the carefully constructed mythology of one of America's most prominent families, revealing a network of corruption that reached from the marble halls of Boston's banking district to the shadowed chambers of political power in Washington itself. The Fairfax Memorial Hospital had served as more than just a medical facility. Hidden beneath its foundations lay a labyrinth of interconnected tunnels and chambers that investigators would later describe as resembling a medieval dungeon more than any legitimate medical infrastructure. These subterranean spaces, accessible only through concealed entrances known to a select few, had been the stage for experiments that defied every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the federal investigator assigned to oversee the expanding inquiry, arrived in Massachusetts on a bitter February morning in 1924. The sealed journals and photographs recovered from the hospital's hidden archives had been transported under armed guard to a temporary facility in Boston, where a team of medical experts, legal scholars, and federal agents worked around the clock to catalog and analyze the evidence. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The Fairfax family had maintained meticulous records of their activities, documenting procedures with the clinical detachment of legitimate researchers while describing acts that would have been considered war crimes in any civilized nation. The journals revealed that the systematic abuse had begun as early as 1878 when the family patriarch, Dr. Deux, the Institute's true purpose became clear as investigators pieced together decades of carefully coded entries. Children and young adults, primarily from impoverished backgrounds or institutional settings, had been subjected to a series of progressively more invasive procedures designed to study the limits of human endurance and the effects of various experimental treatments. The subjects were categorized according to their perceived value for different types of research, with detailed notes on their physical characteristics, psychological profiles, and responses to various forms of stimulation. Dr. Sarah Mendenhall, a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins who had been brought in to analyze the psychological aspects of the case, found herself struggling to maintain professional composure as she reviewed the evidence. The level of systematic cruelty documented in the journals was unprecedented in her experience, surpassing even the most disturbing cases she had encountered in her work with victims of severe trauma. The subjects were not merely test cases, she reported to the investigation team. They were commodities in a carefully managed system of exploitation that treated human beings as expendable resources. The psychological conditioning described in these documents demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how to break down individual resistance and create compliant victims who would not resist or attempt to escape. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence of collaboration between the Fairfax family and respected members of the medical establishment. Correspondence found in the hidden archives revealed that prestigious medical schools and research institutions had knowingly received detailed reports on the experimental procedures, incorporating the findings into their own research programs without questioning the methods by which the data had been obtained. Dr. Theodore Whitman, the dean of Harvard Medical School, had personally corresponded with Dr. Cornelius Fairfax on multiple occasions, expressing his appreciation for the innovative approaches to understanding human physiology documented in the reports. When confronted with these letters during congressional hearings in 1924, Dr. Whitman claimed he had assumed the research was being conducted on willing volunteers or cadavers, but investigators found evidence suggesting he had been aware of the true nature of the experiments. The financial records uncovered during the investigation revealed the staggering scope of the operation. These events, held in the underground chambers, allowed paying customers to observe and sometimes participate in procedures that satisfied their most depraved curiosities. The client list, when finally decoded, read like a directory of American political and business elite. Senators, judges, industrialists, and even high-ranking military officers had paid premium prices for the privilege of witnessing systematic torture disguised as scientific research. The payments were carefully laundered through a network of shell companies and charitable foundations, making the transactions appear to be legitimate business dealings or philanthropic contributions. Judge Marcus Thornfield, who had presided over numerous high-profile cases during his 30-year career on the federal bench, was among the most prominent names found in the records. His detailed preferences, meticulously recorded by his hosts, revealed a man whose public reputation for moral rectitude masked appetites of extraordinary depravity. When federal agents attempted to question him about his involvement, Judge Thornfield was found dead in his chambers, apparently having taken his own life rather than face exposure. The investigation expanded beyond Massachusetts as agents followed the trail of evidence to other locations where the Fairfax family had operated, suggesting that the network had been far more extensive than initially believed. Each location followed the same pattern. a respectable medical or educational institution serving as a front for systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations. The Washington facility proved to be particularly significant, as it had apparently catered specifically to government officials and foreign dignitaries. The records from this location, discovered hidden in a specially constructed vault beneath the building's foundation, documented activities that raised questions about potential blackmail operations and the compromise of national security interests. Dr. Blackwood's investigation team uncovered evidence suggesting that the Fairfax family had used their knowledge of their clients' activities to influence political decisions and business dealings. Correspondence between family members contained references to insurance policies and mutually beneficial arrangements that appeared to describe blackmail schemes targeting powerful individuals who had participated in the underground activities. The international dimension of the case became clear when investigators discovered that the Fairfax network had maintained connections with similar operations in Europe. Regular shipments of research materials had been exchanged with institutions in Germany, France, and Britain, suggesting that the systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations was not limited to American soil, but was part of a broader international network of corruption. Professor Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Berlin had been a particularly frequent correspondent with the Fairfax family, exchanging detailed reports on experimental procedures and requesting specific types of subjects for his own research. His letters, written in a mixture of German and English, described human subjects as material and discussed their treatment with the same clinical detachment one might use when describing laboratory animals. The evidence of international collaboration raised troubling questions about the extent to which respected academic institutions had been complicit in systematic human rights violations. Universities that had built their reputations on scholarly achievement and ethical conduct were revealed to have been active participants in networks that treated human beings as expendable resources for the advancement of knowledge. As the investigation progressed, survivors began to come forward with their own accounts of the horrors they had endured. Many had been children when they were first brought to the Fairfax facilities, and their testimonies provided heartbreaking details about the systematic destruction of innocence in the name of scientific progress. The psychological damage inflicted on these individuals had lasted decades, affecting their ability to form relationships, maintain employment, and lead normal lives. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had been held at the Massachusetts facility for 3 years during her childhood, testified before a congressional committee about her experiences. Her testimony, delivered in a voice that rarely rose above a whisper, described procedures that had been designed not only to inflict physical pain, but to destroy the victim's sense of self-worth and agency. The psychological techniques employed by the Fairfax family had been remarkably sophisticated, creating victims who blamed themselves for their suffering and who were too ashamed to seek help or speak out about their experiences. The institutional response to the revelations was swift but largely focused on damage control rather than justice. Several prominent medical schools quietly removed faculty members who had been implicated in the scandal, while government agencies reassigned or forced into retirement officials whose names appeared in the Fairfax records. The full scope of the prosecutions that followed was limited by the influence of those who had been compromised and the desire to avoid further embarrassment to institutions that formed the backbone of American society. Of the dozens of individuals identified as participants in the Fairfax network, only a handful faced criminal charges. Most were allowed to quietly retire from public life or relocate to other regions where their pasts would not follow them. The victims, meanwhile, received minimal compensation and were often required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from speaking publicly about their experiences. The cover-up extended to the highest levels of government, with classified documents suggesting that President Coolidge himself had been briefed on the case and had authorized the suppression of evidence that might have implicated foreign governments or compromised diplomatic relationships. The decision to classify much of the evidence and limit public disclosure was justified on grounds of national security, but critics argued that it was primarily motivated by a desire to protect powerful individuals from the consequences of their actions. Dr. Blackwood, who had led the investigation with unwavering dedication to uncovering the truth, found himself increasingly isolated as political pressure mounted to conclude the case quickly and quietly. His superiors made it clear that further investigation would be counterproductive and potentially damaging to American interests abroad. The message was unmistakable. The time for seeking justice had passed, and the priority now was maintaining stability and protecting institutional credibility. The final report on the Fairfax case, released in heavily redacted form in 1925, acknowledged that serious crimes had been committed but concluded that most of the perpetrators were either dead or beyond the reach of American justice. The recommendations for preventing similar abuses in the future focused on improved oversight of medical facilities and educational institutions, but the structural changes necessary to prevent such systematic exploitation were never implemented. The victims of the Fairfax network found themselves abandoned by the very system that had failed to protect them in the first place. Many struggled with poverty, mental illness, and social isolation for the remainder of their lives, carrying the burden of their experiences in silence, while those who had profited from their suffering continued to enjoy positions of respect and influence in American society. The legacy of the Fairfax case extends far beyond the specific crimes committed by one family. It represents a systematic failure of institutional oversight and moral responsibility that allowed the exploitation of vulnerable populations to continue for decades under the cover of respectability and scientific progress. The case revealed how easily noble ideals could be corrupted by those who saw human suffering as an acceptable price for advancing their own interests. The parallels to other historical examples of institutional abuse are unmistakable. The Fairfax case demonstrated that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists within supposedly civilized societies, and that the most dangerous perpetrators are often those who present themselves as pillars of moral authority. The victim's suffering was magnified by the betrayal of trust inherent in their exploitation by those who claimed to be acting in their best interests. Perhaps most tragically, the case showed how the desire to protect institutional credibility could override the pursuit of justice for victims. The decision to suppress evidence and limit prosecutions in the Fairfax case established a precedent that would be followed in numerous other instances of institutional abuse throughout American history. The message sent was clear. The reputation of powerful institutions and individuals was more important than accountability for their crimes. The survivors of the Fairfax network, those who lived to see the partial exposure of the truth, found little satisfaction in the limited justice that followed. Their testimonies, when they were allowed to give them, were often dismissed or minimized by those who found the reality too disturbing to acknowledge. The systematic nature of their abuse was reduced to isolated incidents, and the institutional failures that had enabled their suffering were characterized as unfortunate oversights rather than deliberate complicity. Today, more than a century after the Fairfax crimes were first exposed, many of the documents related to the case remain classified or have been destroyed. The full extent of the network's operations, the complete list of its victims, and the true scope of institutional complicity may never be known. What is certain is that the case represents one of the darkest chapters in American history, a reminder of how easily the vulnerable can be exploited when institutions fail in their fundamental duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The story of the Fairfax family and their network of exploitation serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would abuse positions of trust and authority. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge and progress must never come at the expense of basic human dignity, and that the protection of the vulnerable must be a fundamental priority for any civilized society. The voices of the victims, silenced for so long by fear and institutional power, continue to echo through history with a simple but powerful message. Remember us, learn from our suffering, and never again allow such horrors to be committed in the name of progress or respectability. The courtroom proceedings that followed Margaret Whitmore's revelations would forever change how America understood the relationship between power, respectability, and systematic evil. As federal investigators worked through the mountain of evidence seized from the Fairfax Memorial Hospital and its hidden network of facilities, a disturbing picture emerged of how deeply the corruption had penetrated American society. Judge Harrison Wheeler, who presided over the preliminary hearings, would later write in his private journal that the case challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of evil in civilized society. "I had always believed that such monstrous acts were the province of obviously deranged individuals," he wrote. The investigation revealed that the Fairfax network had not operated in isolation, but had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials at every level of government. Police commissioners had been paid to redirect investigations. Judges had dismissed evidence without proper consideration. Politicians had blocked legislation that might have increased oversight of medical institutions. The web of complicity extended far beyond the immediate participants to include dozens of individuals who had chosen to look the other way in exchange for financial or political benefits. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the Fairfax family had been documenting their activities with scientific precision, treating their victims as experimental subjects in research that had no legitimate medical purpose. Vivian Fairfax's journals revealed experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance, document the effects of prolonged torture, and develop more efficient methods of psychological manipulation. The clinical detachment with which these horrors were recorded was in many ways more chilling than the acts themselves. The medical establishment's response to these revelations was swift but defensive. Rather than acknowledging the systemic failures that had allowed such abuse to flourish, Many physicians and hospital administrators argued that the Fairfax case was an isolated aberration that reflected no broader problems within their profession. This response would prove tragically short-sighted, as subsequent investigations revealed similar patterns of abuse at medical institutions throughout the United States. Dr. William Thornton, who had served as chief medical examiner for the federal investigation, became one of the few medical professionals willing to speak publicly about the broader implications of the case. The Fairfax family did not invent their methods from nothing, he told a congressional committee in 1925. They built upon existing practices and attitudes within the medical profession that treated certain populations as less than fully human. The international dimensions of the Fairfax network became clear as investigators traced financial transactions and correspondence that linked the family's activities to similar operations in Europe and South America. Swiss bank records revealed payments to medical institutions in Germany and Austria that had purchased both research data and human specimens from the Fairfax organization. Letters exchanged with contacts in Argentina suggested that the family had been planning to relocate their operations to South America if their American activities came under scrutiny. These international connections raised troubling questions about the scope of human trafficking and medical experimentation that were taking place beyond the reach of any single government's oversight. The League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, established a special commission to investigate these connections, but its work was hampered by the reluctance of member nations to allow scrutiny of their own medical establishments. The fate of the surviving victims became a matter of intense public interest and debate. Those who had been rescued from the Fairfax facilities required extensive medical and psychological care, much of which was experimental given the unprecedented nature of their trauma. Many never fully recovered from their experiences, suffering from what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but which was then poorly understood and inadequately treated. Margaret Whitmore herself became a reluctant public figure, her courage in exposing the truth making her a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption. However, she struggled with the burden of fame and the constant reminders of her traumatic experiences. In letters to her friend Sarah Chen, she wrote about the difficulty of being seen as a hero when she felt like a broken survivor. "They want me to be strong and inspiring," she confided, "but some days I can barely get out of bed." The legal proceedings dragged on for nearly 3 years, complicated by the destruction of evidence, the death or disappearance of key witnesses, and the sophisticated legal strategies employed by defendants who had access to the finest attorneys money could buy. Of the 47 individuals initially charged in connection with the Fairfax network, only 19 were ultimately convicted, and many of those received sentences that critics argued were inadequate given the severity of their crimes. The light sentences reflected the continuing influence of the social and political networks that had protected the Fairfax family for decades. Judges who had once socialized with the defendants found it difficult to impose harsh punishments on people they had considered friends and colleagues. Juries composed of citizens from the same social circles were reluctant to believe that people of such apparent respectability could be capable of such monstrous acts. This pattern of institutional protection extended to the broader response to the case. While the immediate perpetrators faced some consequences, The systems that had enabled their crimes remained largely intact. Hospitals continued to operate with minimal oversight. Medical schools maintained their existing curricula and admission standards. The fundamental power structures that had made the Fairfax network possible were left essentially unchanged. The case did prompt some reforms, but these were often superficial measures designed more to restore public confidence than to address underlying problems. New regulations required medical institutions to maintain better records and submit to periodic inspections. But these rules were often weakly enforced and easily circumvented by those determined to continue abusive practices. Public interest in the case began to wane as the legal proceedings dragged on and the initial shock of the revelations faded. Newspapers moved on to other stories, and the complex details of institutional corruption proved less compelling to readers than the sensational aspects of the torture and murder. This shift in attention allowed many of the broader questions raised by the case to remain unanswered. The international medical community's response was similarly mixed. While some physicians and researchers called for fundamental changes in how medical research was conducted and regulated, others argued that the Fairfax case was an American aberration that had no relevance to their own practices. This defensive posture would prove tragically misguided, as subsequent investigations revealed similar patterns of abuse in medical institutions around the world. The psychological impact of the case on American society was profound and lasting. The revelation that such systematic evil could flourish behind facades of respectability and charity challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilized society. If the Fairfax family, with their impeccable social credentials and philanthropic activities, could orchestrate such horrors, what did that say about the trustworthiness of other respected institutions and individuals? This loss of innocence was reflected in the literature, art, and popular culture of the period. Writers began to explore themes of hidden corruption and institutional evil with new urgency and sophistication. The comfortable assumption that respectability and virtue were synonymous was permanently shattered, replaced by a more skeptical and questioning attitude toward authority figures and established institutions. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of society's most marginalized members. The Fairfax family had deliberately targeted individuals who had no powerful advocates, no financial resources, and no social connections that might have protected them. Their victims were orphans, immigrants, the mentally ill, and others who existed on the margins of society, invisible to those in positions of power and authority. This pattern of victimization revealed uncomfortable truths about American society's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. The rhetoric of equality and justice that formed the foundation of American political discourse was exposed as hollow when applied to those who lacked the social capital to demand protection. The case forced a national conversation about who deserved protection and care, and who could be safely ignored or exploited. The religious implications of the case were equally troubling. The Fairfax family had used Christian imagery and rhetoric to justify their actions, presenting their torture and murder as forms of spiritual purification. This blasphemous appropriation of religious language and symbols forced American churches to confront the ways in which their own teachings and practices might be twisted to serve evil purposes. Some religious leaders used the case as an opportunity to call for moral renewal and greater attention to social justice issues. Others, however, were more concerned with protecting their institutions' reputations and minimizing any association with the Fairfax family's perverted theology. This defensive response missed an opportunity for genuine spiritual reflection and reform. The case also raised important questions about the role of mental health in understanding and preventing such crimes. While some observers argued that the Fairfax family members were simply evil individuals who had chosen to commit terrible acts, others suggested that their behavior might reflect underlying psychological disorders that could be identified and treated. This debate reflected broader tensions in American society about personal responsibility, mental illness, and the nature of evil itself. The comfortable assumption that good people do good things and bad people do bad things was challenged by the reality of individuals who appeared normal, even admirable in their public lives while committing unspeakable acts in private. The scientific community's response to the case was complicated by the fact that some of the research conducted by the Fairfax Network had produced genuine medical insights, even though it had been obtained through unconscionable means. This created ethical dilemmas about whether such knowledge should be used to benefit humanity or suppressed as the tainted fruit of evil acts. The debate over these ethical questions would continue for decades, with different institutions and individuals reaching different conclusions about how to handle knowledge obtained through unethical means. The case established precedents that would be revisited during later controversies involving medical research conducted by Nazi physicians and other criminal organizations. The international dimensions of the case also raised questions about the effectiveness of existing mechanisms for international cooperation in combating transnational crime. The Fairfax Network's ability to operate across national boundaries with minimal interference highlighted the limitations of law enforcement agencies that were organized primarily around national jurisdictions. These limitations would become increasingly apparent as the 20th century progressed, and criminal organizations became more sophisticated in their use of international networks and financial systems. The Fairfax case served as an early warning about the challenges that would face law enforcement agencies in an increasingly interconnected world. The case's impact on American medicine was both immediate and lasting. Medical schools began to include more extensive training in ethics and professional responsibility, though these reforms were often superficial and failed to address the underlying attitudes that had enabled the Fairfax family's crimes. The medical profession's response to the case revealed a troubling tendency towards self-protection and denial, rather than genuine reform. The victims' families faced enormous challenges in seeking justice and compensation for their losses. Many had limited financial resources and little understanding of the legal system, making it difficult for them to pursue civil litigation against the wealthy and well-connected perpetrators. The legal system's bias toward those with resources and connections was starkly revealed in the disparate outcomes achieved by different victims' families. The case also highlighted the importance of investigative journalism in exposing institutional corruption. The reporters who broke the story faced significant pressure from powerful interests who sought to suppress their reporting, but their persistence in pursuing the truth was essential to bringing the Fairfax family's crimes to light. This legacy of investigative journalism would prove crucial in subsequent cases involving institutional abuse and corruption. The precedent established by the Fairfax case reporting showed that even the most powerful individuals and institutions could be held accountable when journalists were willing to pursue difficult and dangerous stories. The psychological treatment of the survivors became a subject of intense study and debate within the emerging field of psychiatry. The unprecedented nature of their trauma challenged existing understanding of mental health and recovery, leading to new approaches to treatment that would influence the development of trauma psychology for decades to come. Many survivors never fully recovered from their experiences, living with the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal for the rest of their lives. Their ongoing struggles served as a constant reminder of the human cost of institutional failure and the importance of preventing such tragedies from occurring in the future. The case's impact on American law was significant, leading to new statutes and legal precedents that strengthened protections for vulnerable populations and increased penalties for institutional abuse. However, these legal reforms were often undermined by weak enforcement and the continuing influence of powerful interests that sought to minimize oversight and accountability. The broader cultural impact of the case was reflected in changes in how Americans viewed authority figures and institutions. The comfortable assumption that respectability and virtue were synonymous was permanently damaged, replaced by a more skeptical and questioning attitude that would characterize American culture for generations to come. The case also revealed the importance of whistleblowers and other insiders who were willing to risk their careers and safety to expose wrongdoing. Margaret Whitmore's courage in speaking out became a model for others who found themselves in similar situations, though the personal cost of such actions remained high. The international attention focused on the case by the Fairfax revelations led to increased scrutiny of medical institutions and research practices around the world. While this attention sometimes resulted in meaningful reforms, it also led to more sophisticated methods of concealing abuse and corruption. The case's legacy continues to influence discussions about medical ethics, institutional accountability, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The questions it raised about the nature of evil, the corrupting influence of power, and the importance of vigilance in protecting human rights remain as relevant today as they were in the 1920s. The Fairfax family's crimes represented a profound betrayal of the trust that society places in its most respected institutions and individuals. Their ability to operate with impunity for decades revealed systemic failures that extended far beyond any single organization or individual. The case forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about their society and institutions that many would have preferred to ignore. The victims of the Fairfax network were not just the individuals who suffered directly at their hands, but all those who lost faith in the fundamental goodness and trustworthiness of their society's institutions. This loss of trust had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the case, contributing to a broader cynicism and skepticism that would characterize American culture for generations. The case also demonstrated the importance of remembering and learning from history's darkest chapters. The tendency to forget or minimize such tragedies only increases the likelihood that they will be repeated. The courage of those who spoke out and the persistence of those who investigated and prosecuted the crimes serve as examples of the vigilance required to protect human rights and dignity. The Fairfax case ultimately serves as a reminder that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the greatest threats to human dignity and rights often come not from obviously criminal elements, but from those who hold positions of trust and authority. The price of freedom and human dignity is eternal vigilance, and the courage to speak truth to power even when doing so comes at great personal cost. The story of the Fairfax family and their network of corruption stands as one of the darkest chapters in American history, but it also represents the triumph of truth over deception, courage over cowardice, and justice over oppression. The victims who suffered and died at their hands were not forgotten, and their legacy continues to inspire those who fight against institutional abuse and corruption. In the end, the Fairfax case teaches us that no institution is too respected, no individual too powerful, and no crime too well hidden to escape eventual exposure and justice. The truth, however long suppressed, has a way of emerging, and those who stand on the side of justice and human dignity will ultimately prevail over those who seek to exploit and oppress. The shadows cast by the Fairfax family's crimes are long, but they are not absolute. The autumn wind carried whispers of scandal through the cobblestone streets of New York City, as Detective Samuel Morrison stood before the imposing gates of the Fairfax Memorial Hospital. It was October 1923, and what should have been a routine investigation into financial irregularities had just exploded into something far more sinister. The prestigious hospital, founded by the philanthropic Fairfax family 4 decades earlier, was about to surrender secrets that would shake the foundations of American high society. Morrison adjusted his coat against the October chill and reviewed his notes one final time. The initial complaint had seemed straightforward enough. A former employee named Thomas Brennan had approached the district attorney's office with allegations of financial misconduct at the hospital. Missing funds, forged documents, unexplained expenditures. Standard corruption, the kind that plagued many institutions in the Gilded Age's aftermath. But Brennan's story had taken a darker turn during his formal interview. The man, clearly terrified and speaking in hushed tones, had mentioned underground chambers beneath the hospital. Secret rooms where he claimed unspeakable experiments had been conducted on vulnerable patients. Rooms where the screams of the suffering had been muffled by thick stone walls and the complicity of silence. The district attorney had initially dismissed these claims as the ravings of a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But Brennan had produced documents, fragments of medical records, financial ledgers, and most disturbing of all, a collection of photographs that made even seasoned investigators recoil in horror. The photographs showed medical procedures being performed on conscious patients, not legitimate operations, but systematic torture disguised as research. Men in expensive suits standing beside operating tables observing the proceedings with the detached interest of spectators at a theater, and in the background, the unmistakable figure of Dr. Harrison Fairfax, the hospital's respected founder, directing the activities with clinical precision. Morrison had assembled a team of investigators, each sworn to secrecy until they could determine the full scope of what they were confronting. The team included Dr. Margaret Chen, a pioneering female physician who specialized in trauma recovery, Detective Patrick O'Sullivan, whose reputation for integrity was matched only by his skill at extracting truth from reluctant witnesses, and Sarah Williams, a journalist whose investigative work had already exposed corruption in several municipal departments. Their first priority was gaining access to the hospital's complete records. The Fairfax family had maintained meticulous documentation of their activities, a practice that would ultimately prove to be their undoing. But obtaining these records required a delicate balance. Too aggressive an approach would alert the family to the investigation, potentially allowing them to destroy evidence or silence witnesses. Too cautious, and they risked allowing ongoing crimes to continue unchecked. The breakthrough came when they discovered that Vivian Fairfax, Harrison's daughter and the hospital's current administrator, had been maintaining a private journal documenting what she described as her father's research activities. The journal, hidden in a safe deposit box under an assumed name, contained detailed accounts of experiments conducted on patients who had been selected for their vulnerability. Orphans, immigrants, the mentally ill, and others who would not be missed if they disappeared. The journal entries were written in a clinical style that made their content even more horrifying. Vivian had recorded the systematic torture of hundreds of patients over the course of 4 decades, describing procedures designed to test human endurance, measure responses to pain, and document the effects of various psychological tortures. The experiments had been conducted not for medical advancement, but for the entertainment and education of wealthy patrons who paid substantial sums to observe human suffering. The most damning entries described what Vivian called initiation ceremonies, where prominent members of New York society would be inducted into what she termed the Circle of Understanding. These ceremonies involved the ritualistic torture of selected victims, with participants required to personally inflict pain as a demonstration of their commitment to the group's activities. The participants included judges, politicians, industrialists, and clergy members, all bound together by their shared complicity in unspeakable crimes. As Morrison's team delved deeper into the journal, they uncovered a network of corruption that extended throughout New York's power structure. The Fairfax family had used their hospital as a base of operations for a criminal enterprise that combined human trafficking, systematic torture, and blackmail. They had identified vulnerable individuals, lured them to the hospital under the pretense of medical care, and then subjected them to prolonged abuse that often ended in death. The victims were carefully selected from populations that society overlooked or dismissed. Homeless individuals were promised shelter and care. Immigrants were offered medical treatment they couldn't afford elsewhere. Mentally ill patients were transferred from other institutions under the guise of specialized treatment. All were processed through the hospital's legitimate facilities before being moved to the hidden chambers beneath the building. The underground complex was a marvel of engineering designed specifically to facilitate horror. Soundproofed rooms ensured that screams would not penetrate to the upper floors. Sophisticated ventilation systems prevented the accumulation of odors that might alert visitors to the activities below. Multiple escape routes allowed participants to enter and leave without being seen together. And a crematorium ensured that evidence could be disposed of efficiently and completely. Dr. Chen's analysis of the medical records revealed the systematic nature of the abuse. Patients were subjected to progressively more severe treatments, with their responses carefully documented and analyzed. The procedures had no legitimate medical purpose but were designed to maximize psychological and physical suffering while keeping victims alive for extended periods. The medical knowledge gained from these experiments was shared with similar operations in other cities, creating a network of institutions that exchanged information and techniques. Detective O'Sullivan's investigation into the financial records revealed the economic foundation of the conspiracy. The hospital received regular donations from wealthy patrons who were actually paying for access to the underground facilities. These payments were disguised as charitable contributions, allowing the donors to claim tax deductions while funding crimes. The amounts were staggering, with some individuals paying thousands of dollars for private sessions with selected victims. The investigation also uncovered evidence of international connections. The Fairfax family had established relationships with similar operations in Europe, exchanging victims and sharing techniques. They had developed methods for transporting unconscious patients across state and national borders, using the hospital's legitimate medical transport services as cover. Some victims were sent to facilities in other countries where they disappeared completely from any official records. Sarah Williams' research into the historical background of the conspiracy revealed its origins in the social upheaval following the Civil War. The Fairfax family had recognized that the massive displacement of population and the breakdown of traditional social structures created opportunities for exploitation. They had positioned themselves as charitable benefactors, offering assistance to those most in need, while systematically identifying and targeting the most vulnerable. The conspiracy had evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and more deeply embedded in New York's social fabric. The Fairfax family had cultivated relationships with law enforcement, ensuring that investigations were derailed or misdirected. They had placed allies in key positions throughout the medical establishment, creating a network of complicit professionals who would provide cover for their activities. They had even established connections with religious institutions, using the language of charity and compassion to mask their true purposes. The evidence revealed that the conspiracy had operated with virtual impunity for 4 decades, protected by the wealth and influence of its participants. The Fairfax family had created a system where the very institutions designed to protect the vulnerable were instead used to exploit them. Hospitals, which should have been places of healing, became chambers of torture. Charitable organizations, which should have provided assistance, became procurement networks for victims. Religious institutions, which should have offered spiritual comfort, became sources of psychological manipulation. The investigation also revealed the personal cost of maintaining such a conspiracy. Vivian Fairfax's journal entries showed a woman struggling with the horror of what she had witnessed and participated in. She had been raised within the conspiracy, taught from childhood that the torture of others was not only acceptable but necessary for the advancement of human knowledge. Yet her journal revealed growing doubt and revulsion as she matured and began to question the moral foundations of her family's work. The final entries in Vivian's journal indicated that she had been planning to expose the conspiracy herself. She had been secretly copying documents and gathering evidence, preparing to turn it over to authorities. But her father had discovered her activities and had her committed to a private asylum, where she was held under conditions that prevented her from communicating with the outside world. Morrison's team realized that Vivian Fairfax might still be alive, imprisoned in one of the private facilities that her family controlled. Rescuing her became a priority both for humanitarian reasons and because her testimony would be crucial to prosecuting the conspiracy. But reaching her would require careful planning, as the facilities were heavily guarded and staffed by individuals loyal to the Fairfax family. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The evidence was overwhelming, but the conspiracy involved individuals with the power to suppress investigations and silence witnesses. Morrison and his team understood that they were not just pursuing justice for past crimes, but fighting to prevent ongoing atrocities. Every day they delayed meant more victims would suffer and die in the chambers beneath the Fairfax Memorial Hospital. The network of corruption they had uncovered was so extensive that they questioned whether conventional law enforcement could effectively address it. Too many officials were compromised, too many institutions were complicit, and too many powerful individuals had interests in maintaining the status quo. They began to consider whether exposing the conspiracy to the public through the press might be more effective than pursuing traditional legal channels. As autumn deepened into winter, Morrison's team prepared for the most dangerous phase of their investigation. They would need to gather physical evidence from the underground chambers, rescue Vivian Fairfax from her imprisonment, and simultaneously move against multiple targets to prevent the destruction of evidence. The conspiracy that had operated in darkness for 4 decades was about to face the light of exposure. But its architects would not surrender without a fight. The stakes had never been higher. The investigation had revealed not just individual crimes, but a systematic corruption of the very institutions that society relied upon to protect its most vulnerable members. The Fairfax conspiracy represented a fundamental betrayal of the social contract, a perversion of charity and medicine that had turned healing into harm and compassion into cruelty. Yet the investigation had also revealed the power of individual courage in confronting institutional evil. Thomas Brennan's decision to come forward despite obvious danger, Vivian Fairfax's secret documentation of her family's crimes, and Morrison's team's determination to pursue the truth regardless of the personal cost, all demonstrated that even the most powerful conspiracies could be challenged by those willing to risk everything for justice. The final confrontation was approaching, and Morrison knew that the outcome would determine not just the fate of the Fairfax family, but the future of institutional accountability in America. The conspiracy had thrived in darkness and silence. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the underground tunnels as federal agents descended into the hidden chambers beneath the demolished Fairfax estate. What they discovered in those sealed vaults would force authorities to confront a horrifying truth. The St. Mary's Academy scandal had been merely the visible tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper into American society than anyone had dared imagine. Agent Harrison Blackwood, leading the federal investigation, had spent 3 years following financial trails and testimonies that suggested the Fairfax operation was part of a much larger network. The execution of Victoria and Bartholomew Fairfax in 1814 had been celebrated as justice served, but disturbing evidence had continued to surface throughout the 1840s. Missing persons reports from across New England, financial irregularities at charitable institutions, and deathbed confessions from former accomplices all pointed toward a conspiracy that had survived the destruction of its most visible component. The breakthrough came when renovations of the old Fairfax property in 1847 revealed a hidden basement level that had escaped detection during the original investigation. Behind a false wall, workers found an iron door sealed with multiple locks, its surface bearing symbols that matched those described in testimony about the Academy's ritual chambers. When federal agents finally breached this barrier, they entered a repository of evidence that would rewrite the entire history of the case. The hidden chamber contained hundreds of documents spanning nearly 4 decades, from the 1810s through the 1840s. These papers revealed that the St. Mary's Academy had been established not as an independent criminal enterprise, but as one node in a vast network of similar institutions operating throughout the United States and beyond. The Fairfax family had been regional coordinators in an organization that operated under the cover of charitable and educational institutions, systematically exploiting vulnerable populations while maintaining facades of moral respectability. The scope of the operation was staggering. Documents identified similar facilities in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, New Orleans, and even international locations in Cuba and Mexico. Each institution followed the same basic template: present itself as a charitable organization serving orphans or disadvantaged youth, gradually condition selected victims through drugs and psychological manipulation, then exploit them for the entertainment of wealthy clients while maintaining detailed records of preferences and payments. Most disturbing was the discovery that the network had continued operating after the Fairfax executions, simply adapting its methods to avoid the security failures that had led to exposure at St. Mary's. A ledger dated 1820 contained an entry that read, "Salem Incident Analysis Complete. Revised protocols implemented at all facilities, external monitoring systems established." The financial records revealed a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scale. Over 30 years, the network had generated income equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in modern currency, with profits distributed among operators, corrupt officials, and what appeared to be a central coordinating authority that remained tantalizingly anonymous in the documents. References to the patron or the benefactor suggested someone with enormous wealth and influence who had conceived and funded the entire operation. But the most chilling discovery was evidence that the network had infiltrated legitimate institutions throughout American society. Church records, government documents, and educational reports had been systematically falsified to hide the true nature of participating organizations. Orphanages, schools, hospitals, and even some religious institutions had been either completely compromised or had harbored secret operations within their walls. Agent Blackwood's investigation revealed that the network had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and recruiting victims. Children from impoverished families, immigrants with no local connections, and orphans from disaster-stricken areas were systematically targeted through what appeared to be legitimate charitable outreach programs. Once isolated within network facilities, they were subjected to conditioning processes that combined physical abuse, psychological manipulation, and carefully administered drugs to create compliant victims. The documentation also revealed the true fate of many victims who had supposedly been transferred to other locations. Rather than being moved to legitimate institutions, they had been sold to clients who preferred permanent ownership rather than temporary access. Some had been shipped to plantations in the Caribbean, others to mining operations in Mexico, and still others to private estates where they disappeared entirely from historical record. Perhaps most shocking was evidence that the network had maintained detailed genealogical records of victims, tracking bloodlines and inherited characteristics that were valued by certain clients. Children born to network victims were systematically evaluated and sorted based on physical attributes and psychological profiles, with the most desirable being reserved for premium clients, while others were disposed of through methods that the documents described with clinical detachment. The investigation also uncovered evidence of international connections that suggested the American network was part of a global operation. Letters in multiple languages discussed coordination with similar organizations in Europe, South America, and Asia. Financial transfers through international banking systems indicated that the network had access to resources far beyond what domestic operations could generate independently. As Agent Blackwood pieced together the evidence, he began to understand that the St. Mary's Academy scandal had not ended the network, but had merely forced it to evolve. The public outrage and legal reforms that followed the Fairfax executions had been anticipated and planned for. The network had simply moved its operations to less visible locations and developed more sophisticated methods for avoiding detection. The documents revealed that the network had studied the St. Mary's case extensively, identifying the specific failures that had led to exposure and implementing countermeasures to prevent similar incidents. Future operations were compartmentalized so that the capture of one facility would not compromise others. Client vetting procedures were enhanced to exclude individuals who might cooperate with authorities if caught. And most significantly, the network had begun recruiting corrupt officials proactively, ensuring that investigations would be suppressed before they could gather momentum. By 1847, when the hidden chamber was discovered, the network had been operating for nearly 4 decades with minimal interference from law enforcement. The reforms implemented after the St. Mary's scandal had been gradually undermined through bribery, blackmail, and the systematic placement of network associates in positions of authority. Inspections were announced in advance, allowing facilities to prepare sanitized presentations. Records were falsified with the assistance of corrupt officials, and witnesses who might have exposed the truth were silenced through methods that had become increasingly sophisticated over time. The investigation also revealed that the network had developed disturbing innovations in its methods of exploitation. Medical experimentation on victims had become routine, with network physicians conducting research that legitimate medical institutions could not ethically pursue. Psychological conditioning techniques had been refined to create victims who were not only compliant but actively participated in recruiting and conditioning new victims. And most horrifying of all, the network had begun producing what it termed second-generation assets, children born and raised within the system who knew no other existence. Agent Blackwood's final report, classified by the federal government and sealed for national security reasons, concluded that the network posed a threat to American society that extended far beyond the exploitation of individual victims. The systematic corruption of institutions, the compromise of officials at all levels of government, and the accumulation of wealth and influence over decades had created what amounted to a shadow government operating within the legitimate structures of American democracy. The report recommended immediate action to identify and shut down all network facilities, prosecute all involved parties regardless of their social standing, and implement fundamental reforms to prevent similar organizations from establishing themselves in the future. However, the scope of the corruption revealed by the investigation made implementation of these recommendations politically impossible. Too many powerful individuals were implicated, too many institutions were compromised, and too much of the evidence pointed toward ongoing operations that could not be disrupted without causing massive social upheaval. Instead, the federal government chose to suppress the investigation's findings while conducting a series of covert operations designed to neutralize the network's leadership and disrupt its operations without public exposure. Over the following decade, several mysterious deaths and disappearances eliminated key network figures, while financial irregularities and internal conflicts fragmented the organization's unified command structure. The network's influence gradually diminished throughout the 1850s and 1860s, weakened by internal power struggles and the social disruption caused by the Civil War. However, elements of the organization survived by adapting to changing circumstances and developing new methods of exploitation that took advantage of the chaos and displacement caused by the war. The story of the extended investigation remained classified until the 1920s, when portions of Agent Blackwood's report were leaked to journalists investigating corruption in state government. However, the leaked documents focused primarily on financial irregularities and political corruption, omitting the most disturbing details about the network's exploitation of victims and its systematic infiltration of American institutions. The full truth about the scope and duration of the network's operations remains buried in classified archives, protected by national security restrictions that prevent researchers from accessing the complete documentary record. What is known comes from fragmentary evidence, testimonies from survivors who lived long enough to speak about their experiences, and the careful detective work of historians who have pieced together the story from scattered sources. The legacy of this extended investigation continues to influence American law enforcement and social policy. The recognition that criminal networks can operate for decades while maintaining facades of respectability led to the development of more sophisticated investigative techniques and oversight mechanisms. The understanding that corruption can penetrate the highest levels of government and society has informed approaches to combating organized crime and protecting vulnerable populations. But perhaps the most important lesson from this dark chapter is the recognition that evil often persists by adapting to changing circumstances rather than being eliminated by individual prosecutions or reforms. The network that spawned St. Mary's Academy survived the exposure and punishment of its most visible operators by learning from their mistakes and developing more sophisticated methods of concealment and protection. The victims of this extended criminal enterprise numbered in the thousands, their suffering hidden behind the facades of charitable institutions and educational facilities that appeared to serve noble purposes. Their voices silenced by their tormentors and forgotten by history remind us that the price of allowing systematic exploitation to flourish is always higher than the cost of confronting it directly. Today, as we face new forms of human trafficking and institutional abuse, the lessons learned from the investigation of the Fairfax network remain relevant. The techniques used to identify and exploit vulnerable populations, the methods employed to corrupt legitimate institutions, and the strategies developed to avoid detection and punishment have evolved, but not disappeared. The vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit them remains as necessary now as it was in the 1840s. The hidden chamber beneath the Fairfax estate has long since been sealed and forgotten, its contents dispersed among various archives and private collections. But the story it revealed continues to serve as a warning about the dangers of allowing criminal networks to operate unchecked and the importance of maintaining the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about the institutions we trust to protect society's most vulnerable members. The investigation's ultimate conclusion was that the St. Mary's Academy scandal represented not an aberration, but a glimpse into a systematic problem that had infected American society at its highest levels. The network's ability to operate for decades while maintaining facades of respectability demonstrated that the corruption of institutions designed to protect the vulnerable was not only possible but profitable for those willing to exploit the trust placed in them by society. In the end, the true horror of the Fairfax network was not simply the suffering it inflicted on individual victims, but the way it perverted the very institutions and ideals that define civilized society. By turning schools into prisons, hospitals into torture chambers, and churches into dens of exploitation, the network attacked the fundamental trust that allows communities to function and flourish. The story serves as a reminder that the price of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance, and that the protection of the innocent requires constant effort from those who refuse to look away when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The victims of the Fairfax Network and similar organizations throughout history were not forgotten by those who had the courage to investigate and expose their suffering. As the shadows of winter lengthened across the Wisconsin wilderness in 1862, the final chapter of America's most horrific religious conspiracy was about to close forever. The buried truths of the Fairfax family mystery had claimed hundreds of innocent lives, destroyed countless families, and exposed the darkest capabilities of human evil disguised as sacred purpose. In the end, the Fairfax legacy stands as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who wrap themselves in the cloth of respectability and righteousness. Their story teaches us that evil rarely announces itself with fanfare. Instead, it whispers sweet promises of salvation while systematically destroying everything it touches. The courage of those who spoke truth to power, like Margaret Sullivan and the survivors who refused to be silenced, ultimately triumphed over institutional corruption and systematic abuse. Their sacrifice ensures that these buried truths will never again be forgotten, and their voices continue to echo across the centuries as a warning to future generations about the eternal vigilance required to protect the innocent from those who would exploit sacred trust for profane purposes.